right, welcome back everybody. Hope you all had a chance to decompress, get some food, and relax a bit, because we are back. And so the section we're going to be kicking off right now is on watchers and computed properties. So let's, oh yeah, not quite. That's just the cue slide. All right, let's open back up the playground and talk about watchers and computed. So this was that was not that. There you go. This is the playground. Perfect. All right, so we've talked a lot about reactive data, and we saw that it's cool that it tracks, but the next step to reactive data a lot of times comes to the point where it's a question of what happens when things depend on that data, right? So you want something to happen when the reactive data changes. This is actually fairly common. So granted, we're doing a lot of things automatically at this point, right? So for example, when the data updates, Vue will automatically update the HTML. But what do we want to do more fine-grained things? So for example, like we want to say, we want to watch the count up here. And if it's even, we want to go ahead and then say, update the title up here to something else, right? So you can imagine that if we had this to be counter title, for example, and counter title would just put it here. So counter title is going to be, this is standard, for example. So you can see when refresh, great, counter standard here. And we want to say, we want to watch for if the count goes past 20, then we want to add like long to the text. And so your first instinct for those who come from a framework background is to think, well, we need to be able to watch the thing, right? And so to watch something in Vue is actually fairly simple. There actually is a watch option, as you would expect. So we have data, we have methods. Here's our opportunity to watch something. And when you want to watch something, you basically say, what is it exactly that we're watching? Well, in this case, we're watching the count. And so when you actually define the count, though, what you want to do is you want to say, you need the value that is basically going to return to you by default, because otherwise you don't have something to refer to inside of that value. Because it's going to basically say, what's your new value, what's your old value? And so by default, you get the new value as the first one. So let me actually just do new value like this. So you'll see now, here we have a simple watch function that's watching count. And then when it changes, we should automatically see it log. And so, watch count. Did I not refresh? Refreshing would be helpful. There we go. OK, so we can see here, 1826. We're getting some logs as well here from increment count. But we see that at least it's being triggered. So your next thing would be like, OK, well, logically speaking, what I would want to do then is I would say, well, if new value is greater than 20, then this dot counter title, counter title plus equals very long. OK, now refresh. 1, 2, you can see, boom, it's updated. And so from a mental model perspective, you're like, yeah, that makes sense, cool. And so this is actually a common paradigm in a lot of frameworks when it comes to watching reactive dependencies. That's what it's called. But Vue has a better way for us to do this, especially when it comes to modifying existing data. Because if you think about what we're doing here, what we're doing is we're saying, based on a reactive data property, run a specific computation. And then, but if we think about that from a performance perspective, we really only wanted to do that when all the the right dependencies are triggered. And so one of the problems that comes with doing something as like explicitly watching values is sometimes, especially when apps get really large, the watch can end up getting triggered like a lot, like unnecessarily so. And so when you hear things about people accidentally triggering re-renders, that's what they're talking about. Is because at that point, you're manually watching the dependencies. And if you don't know what you're doing or not caching it correctly, all of a sudden you might be triggering re-rendering of thousands of nodes and whatnot. So Vue, in its Vue fashion, came up with an API that would help to abstract that away. And the way it does that is through the idea of computed properties. And so the way computed properties worked is basically another option on your app. So I'm going to add it below data and you'll see shortly why. So computed properties is, think of it as basically performance optimized calculations on reactive data that you have. So in the instance of, for example, the counter title, right? Rather than it be like, OK, well, I'm going to have a watch on this count. If it's 20, then add the thing. Instead, you could be, I'll say display title, for example. And so this will be a function that Vue will basically, it will correctly decide when to run it. So we'll see shortly. And in this function, what are we going to do? We're going to say if this.count is greater than 20, return counter standard. Otherwise, return, oh wait, in this case, it was counter very long. Otherwise, return counter standard, just like that. And so if we switch this over now to display title and refresh, you see nothing changes, and then it's swapped, and then it's good. And basically, even though you might think programmatically this looks very similar to what we just did, this is extremely powerful because what you've just done is now given Vue the job of figuring out when its dependencies have changed. And so to show you what I mean by that, we could even combine computed properties together. So for example, let's say that we actually wanted to impact the increment amount based on the length of the title. Let's just do that. So we could then say, let's say call it optimize increment amount. And for whatever reason, we have some algorithm that's dependent on the counter title. We could say basically if, or basically we could return this.
Sorry.
No, you're good. What we could do instead, we can return this dot counter title, or sorry, this dot display title dot length times, and then let's say this dot increment amount. So now we have two dependencies. We're depending on this display title here. We're dependent on increment amount here. But then once we update here to optimize increment amount, we can see now that things are starting to change actually pretty drastically, right? You're seeing that the, oh, actually, I realized you're not actually seeing the optimized amount. So let's show that real quick. Where's my increment count? OK, here we go. Then we can say optimized increment amount. Very good. So you can see here it's 224 right here. And so it's changing because why? Because we've modified the title. If we modify this times 10, you'll see that now it's updating correctly by the increment amount, but the optimized amount is now dependent on two different things. And so what you get with computed properties is basically really efficient tool chaining on reactive dependencies. And this is a concept we're starting to see popularized. I think Svelte has something very similar as well now, in that if you think about an enterprise level app, there's going to be so much that's changing. And when you have manual definitions of what you're watching, oftentimes you'll find that it's actually fairly brittle because one small change will break that entire dependency chain. Whereas here, you can have your source of truth being this data store, and then you can have all your computations run off of that thing, right? And it knows when to trigger, it knows what to do, it knows how to cache it, so that in the HTML, it doesn't randomly trigger, like all that stuff that like our goal is to build cool things and to abstract business logic, deliver value to customers. As much as it's fun to learn about performance optimizations, that's not something we want to be debugging constantly. And so computed properties are incredibly powerful for this. In fact, like if I were to say my single most favorite feature of Vue, it's the computed property, because it just takes away all the worry for me about what's happening, and it does so much work for me. Again, really easy. And it's particularly powerful if you do any data visualizations. You can imagine, right? You're doing all these SVG calculations based on a set group of data. You don't want to have to write the dependency chain that would update the SVG at this particular point, and then it swaps this way, or how it animates. Like all that can be managed basically with computed properties. And so some of the most elegant stores I've seen have like one source of truth inside of data, and then they compute everything else out. And it works really, really well because Vue can optimize all those things. So I've talked a bit about computed properties and watchers. We're going to have you go ahead and play around with that. So for your exercise, I'll commit the code shortly, but let me just complete this recording. You all have put a bunch of characters inside of your show. So you probably have certain attributes that you can put basically on those characters, right? Whether it's their age, height, whatever you want. But then based on those, add those attributes to your characters, and then use a computed property to start generating some sort of statistics. So for example, mine is Avatar Last Airbender. I could be like, oh, OK, 2 of them are waterbenders, 3 of them are earthbenders, and then I can run computations on the percentage that might be. So just have a play around with that. So I'll give you all 5 minutes to play around with that because it's one of those things where we'll be reusing a lot as we go forward. And so don't worry, you'll get plenty of opportunity to play around with that. So let's put 5 minutes on the clock then for this exercise. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to play around a little bit with compute it and watch. A great question came up during the exercise. Sorry. I'll take that from the top. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Hope that you found that exercise with the computer properties kind of fun to play around with. I know we only had a little bit of time, but again, you'll get plenty of opportunity to practice that because I think it's one of the features we need to use more of and see more of in the ecosystem. So definitely we'll be pushing that. But during the exercise, there was a great question regarding the differences between computed and watch. So let me just go ahead and set this up. At least we have code to talk about. Earlier in the example I showed, you noticed that the reason why I mentioned that the watch is not a great sort of technique in this particular case is because you're dealing with the reactive data. In other words, you're basically doing a computation that you're manually tracking. This is not to say that watch as a technique is invalid, however. What that really means is that when it comes to computing data, combining those things like we see up here with optimized increment amount, where you have multiple dependencies, computed will do a lot of work for you right out of the gate. And so that's when you want to do that. Anytime you're modifying something, returning it, and you want to be like, oh, I want to display something slightly different. And so actually, the question earlier regarding the strings and combining them, that would be an example where the character list, for example, could be like, let's say, comma separated. This is a bad name. But you could do something like this, dot character list, dot split. Like you could do your calculation in here and then just return that in the render thing, and that would already look good. So I will show that later when we're doing it. But to the main point I want to make, though, is that watch is really good for when you want to trigger a side effect on your code base. So in other words, you can imagine if you might want to have a specific API call when your reactive data has hit a certain state. That would be a great example of when computed wouldn't make any sense at all, because computed is about managing data, managing triggering actions, that kind of stuff. Watch is perfect for that kind of stuff. So just know that's the main paradigm difference between the two when it comes to using them. OK, so let's take a look at this example. So I'm going to go to my let's go to my index to do the solution together. OK, so here, OK, I got my characters here. And this time, let's add a property. Let's call their element. And so I know that ang is air, earth, water, and fire. And we won't get into like SQL stuff for anyone who is an Avatar Last Airbender fan. So we have fire. We won't worry about stuff like lightning and iron, metal bending for now, and water. OK. So here we have all of our stuff here. And then for the sake of consistency, let's just make sure we go and add an element here. That's an empty array. Great. OK. So from here, we could do basically some statistics, shall we? So for now, let's go ahead and actually add a h2 here for just characters. So this is consistent. There you go. Characters up top, favorite characters, new character. All right, and then actually, just like I did before, I'm going to go the most recent thing so that it's right at the top, which is easier for people to see. Let's talk about statistics. And so for something like statistics, we want to figure out, for example, like how many, let's talk about how many, so for example, let's see how many earthbenders we have, and then we have how many airbenders, we have waterbenders, and then we have firebenders. OK, a couple ways to do this, but we'll start with the simple approach first, which is that let's say we want to track the earthbenders, right? That was one of the ones I'd mentioned. So let me hide data real quick. So we're going to use a computed property, because we're basically just computing data off of what we already have. So what we can do is we say earthbenders, let's say earthbender list like that. And so return this dot character list, and we're going to filter it based on every character. And basically, we want to know if, actually, let me do this the long way. If character dot element, and then I realized there are more than one, so technically it's not named right, but it's fine. Dot element dot, I think contain should do the trick, earth. And then we are just going to actually, we'll do this one more. Let's see. Return the filter. Oh, yeah, yep. OK, we can do it this way if it contains element earth. and then return true. And then we're returning the length of this thing. So this is a little bit convoluted. I want to go ahead and refactor this real quick. So we can basically say that this contains the earth benders is what this filter does. It goes through all the characters, checks if they have it, and if they have it, then it returns true. So the easier way to actually write this is to return, since the logic is not complicated, we can actually just do it like this. One more. There you go. So there we go, and then once we have our earth benders, we can return earth benders. Oh, actually, we could just return the list itself. I'm not actually overthinking this. OK, here we go. So to show that this actually does work, I'm going to go ahead and render out the earth benders first. So earth bender list. Great. If we refrain, oh, something broke. Contains. I missed that. Is contains? OK, that's fine. That contains always kind of throws me off. Greater than -1. That should be. There we go. Much better. OK, so we'll see here now is that it's gone ahead and taken our list of characters, and it's refined it down to the array with only the characters that have like the earth element. And so this, again, this is useful because then what we could do is we can say, OK, well, then in this case, we have like dot length. And there we go. We have the number of earth benders. And so you could basically duplicate this down as far as doing each one. So I think, though, for the sake of making this a programmatic exercise, we can just say, bender statistics. And rather than break it up each time, we know the list of elements we want. So we have our elements, which is going to be air, earth, fire, and water. And so what we can do is then actually just we're going to return an object where each of these are going to contain like the updated value. That way it's easier to display. Water and fire. OK. Finally, we will loop through every single element. So this dot character list dot for each for every character, and then elements dot for each element. If character dot element dot index of. The naming on this is going to be a little wonky, and it's greater than -1. Then we will say const statistics equals this thing. So actually, you know what? I think I can do this one better. We can actually we can say statistics of the element plus equals 1. Yes. So then we just need to make sure that is good. Just like that. And then we return statistics. OK, that should do the trick. I think. No, wait. If this missing a parentheses. OK, that should do it.
Your index of is still off.
Index of. Oh, you're totally right. Index of element. That's what was off. Good call. Thank you. OK. Now let's give this a shot. So if we just render out the statistics now, what do I call Bender statistics? Then we could say, for each is not liking it because I can't spell. There we go. So we can see here there's one of each. And the reason you get 2 here is because for those that don't know, Ang has all the different elements. So that's how we get that. And you can see we have those computed, that computed property. I see there's a question.
Should we use reduce here and pass statistics object as a default parameter?
Reduce is certainly an option. I just went with what was kind of easier to do since I know reduce can be kind of confusing sometimes for those who don't use it a lot. But reduce would be a great option in this point where we could reduce the array and get the numbers that we want. So, and for those who haven't used the reduce a lot in JavaScript, reduce is pretty magical in that it can do basically everything that you would want it to do. But in that regard, the API can get a little bit complex sometimes. So that's why it's not my go-to when teaching these things. So definitely a number of ways to do this. To be clear, this is just like a quick code together of like how you could cobble together the statistics, but I'm sure there are many ways we could optimize for this. But I just wanted to show that here, now that we actually have everything, we can show that we can li and v4 through this Bender list. So I'll say stat in Bender statistics. And you'll see something interesting, though, is that if we just do this and just render out stat, you'll notice here that it's only rendering out the right side. And that's because, well, guess what? We're in a for loop for an object. And that's JavaScript. So that means that if we want the key as well, we need to actually just open it up, because it's value, then key. So I would say type is probably what I would name that. And then that way, we can do type, :space, refresh. There we go. We have all our elements, and it's being computed, as you would expect. And so as you can imagine, you can even extend on this to be like percentages and all that fun stuff. And you just keep building on your computed properties. And so what's nice about that, because computed properties can be composed, it allows you to approach it in basically kind of like a functional programming way. You code the very small chunk that does this one computation, then depend another chain on that. And then that way, you have actually a very clean sort of setup when it comes to managing those individual calculations. So that said, does anyone have any questions regarding what they just saw? Got a question back there.
In real world projects, could you go through and describe a little bit on when you would use a computed property versus a watcher?
Yeah, sure.
I know you kind of did this with.
Yeah, I can dive into it a little bit more.
If you feel like it's too much repeating yourself, then don't worry about it. But
I think since it was asked, it's worth kind of going to a little bit more in depth. So let me start by actually committing this so that I don't botch anything else. Q. There we go. Okay, let's commit this solution real quick. Feature add computed properties for ATLA. Okay. So to kind of to go over, so the question here is around taking a more real-world example of why computed properties would be advantageous over watchers. Let's think about this. OK. So in the example of a data visualization model, I think that still remains probably one of the better examples of this, in that if you were to try and take a look at any sort of SVG animation out there, chart. You'll know that for something like this, there are a lot of pieces that go into the computation of how this is being drawn. Right? It could be as simple as how big the pie chart is being drawn, or what the data that goes into whether or not it's being filled, what color it might be. There's a lot that's happening here. And so if you try to watch all your dependencies individually, what people have found when they worked with sort of these larger code bases is that if they weren't careful with how they track their dependencies, they could trigger re-renders in their code when they didn't expect to. And for those who have had experience working on enterprise apps, there is almost no way you'll own the code base from end to end. So a lot of times you don't even know that someone is depending on the thing that you're writing for. And so computed properties have the advantage of, because the chains are being tracked basically explicitly via okay, let me go back. When you use computed properties, let me scroll up. When you use computed properties, not only are you containing the dependencies, which I understand watch does do, because if we think about it, when we did watch, you have to actually define the initial value that you're watching. So in this case, let's say it was character list. And then on top of that, can you imagine what happens if you also if this also had like this dot character list is dependent on this dot, let's see, what do I have? Favorite list? Like once you start adding multiple things, especially when you're receiving data from an API, it becomes really difficult to start tracking where everything is. And so computed properties, because you can basically just throw all your dependencies inside of a single compute function, it has the algorithm that's required for you to automatically like do all the performance optimizations and caching that you would want to do. So I think that's the best way I could explain it at this point. And so remember, the key thing here is not that watch is bad, is that watch is good for triggering side effects. And computed, it's kind of like when you import Lodash and you do a debounce function on an API call because you're afraid users will click. Like, imagine computed has like a debounce built in so that things don't automatically trigger, like it knows how to protect you from those things. That's the advantage of computed. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. Cool.
I said thanks.
Great. All right. So with that, let's wrap this section up. And so I know that we've gone through all this, and some of you might be thinking, well, who builds web apps this way, right? Because after all, like every sort of modern tech stack you'll see always talks about build tools and that kind of thing. And to be honest, like progressive enhancement is very much a thing that continues to exist to this day, even though it's not talked about a lot, right? Code rewrites are very sexy, but the truth is when you're dealing with enterprise systems, it's just not realistic to stop everything, that as we talked about before, and write new features. But dropping in the CDN with Vue, having it progressively enhanced, that all works. Because we're not going to cover it at this point because we're going to move into build tools. But a lot of these things we're seeing here, they can be just abstracted into .js files, right? You can actually modularize your code. You can do a lot, actually, and make a fairly robust app. It doesn't have to all live inside of this single option, like this single object that I've shown you all. That's just a way for us to keep it all as a mental model. But eventually, you can break it out, import JS into here, use it. Like, it can still scale pretty darn well. And so this image here, which I love, is like the cake, that then you get the frosting, then you get the candles, right? And so the credit here is to Tiffany Tsay. This is her blog post on what is progressive enhancement and why should you care. So definitely something that I do think modern web developers need to consider when it comes to the realities of upgrading their code base. And so this is a smashing article magazine by Sarah Drasner, who used to be on the Vue core team. And this is a great one because the title of this is Replacing jQuery with Vue.js, no build step necessary. And this is also a very valid way of using Vue. It's like, if you know that only one page on your entire app, like because you're statically generating it, so everything's on the server side, but only one could use some interactivity, don't even need jQuery anymore. You could literally just drop Vue, because I believe the CDN side is either roughly the same, if Vue, if not slightly lower at this point. But that is actually a viable option now. You don't need to even approach Vue as a framework. It can be just little bits of interactivity that are sprinkled in an app. And finally, again, people are always skeptical. They're like, well, who's actually done it this way? Well, GitLab did it this way. GitLab used to actually be a Ruby on Rails app. It was super, and so if anyone works with Ruby on Rails, you know that, especially back then, integrating node-based tool chains into that was extremely painful. And so, again, and also they needed to ship features, right? This was before they went public. They had customers they needed to meet the needs. So they couldn't stop everything and go, yeah, Rails is kind of outdated. We really would love to use a framework, so let's stop building stuff. They couldn't do that. So what did they do? I'm trying to remember actually which page it was. I knew someone who was on the team that did this. They actually, let's just, for example, they had the sign-in page. And they said on the sign-in page, let's add Vue as a CDN. And let's just like add interactivity. And once they proved that that worked well, they went, OK, next one, what's like something we can hit that's like fairly low impact performance-wise that we can do? And I think there was another one that they did. And they basically, that's what they did. They slowly added new features to the customer base while progressively migrating their app to Vue. And then eventually, when they had basically the tipping point of like, they had so much code in Vue that it made sense to like, let's take a couple weeks to like refactor our code to actually use the node tooling to like bring it all in. That's when they actually did that, but they proved their case rather than trying to just tell product, hey, just stop. We have this wonderful idea that if anyone has done ever a massive, app refactoring, it often doesn't go quite as planned, and then deadlines get pushed. But they were able to realistically do that, and so that's how GitLab is now running on Vue now. And so it is and so the reason I wanted to emphasize this method is because it's something that I think is often overlooked when people are thinking about recommending solutions to clients. And it's something that I want people to know about. So whenever you're working for someone or you think that this could be a good approach, you now know that this is here for you. So yeah, that's that. So I think let's go ahead and take, actually wait, no. How are people feeling right now in the room? Doing okay? Okay. I think we're gonna truck on to the fundamentals. All right. So we've talked about CDNs, we've talked about working with just the index.html, but most projects are not going to be run that way. That's just the reality. Most people have bought in fully to the toolchain system, and so it's time that we did so too. All right. So when you, let's see. For those who come from the Vue 2 ecosystem, you're probably used to scaffolding your app with Vue CLI. But there's been a new kid on the block in terms of the whole Webpack build tool chain. And if you haven't heard about it, it's called Vite. And one of the great things about Vite, basically what you need to know is that it's a bundler underneath that's helping to push sort of like front-end tooling to use more ES modules. Basically, it helps to make apps more performant. And what's really nice about Vite, though, as well, is that even though Evan Yu, the creator of Vue, is one of the founders of the Vite technology, it's a multi-framework tooling. And so it's really nice to see a lot of frameworks starting to gather around it. And so for anyone who's interested in this kind of stuff and want to see like helping to create plugins so that other frameworks can leverage that, Vite is doing a very good job as far as bringing the community together. But because of all these performance optimizations, though, Vue CLI currently still uses the Webpack, and so it basically is being deprecated in favor of the Create Vue, which is the new, basically, equivalent of Vue CLI. And for this one, this has Vite powering it underneath. And so this is where the shift is. So going forward, if you're creating a new Vue 3 app and you have the luxury of using Vite underneath, Create Vue is the basically recommended way going forward. So let's go ahead and create a project and see what that looks like, shall we? To do that, we're going to run the command npm create vue 3 inside of our project. So I'm going to go ahead and just close some of this off now. And let's go ahead and open this up. Npm create vue at 3. And so one of the things that's really nice about the modern build toolchains these days is that you don't have to install a massive CLI on your computer only to use it a couple times, maybe like a year or something. It's kind of being called on the fly because NPM knows, oh, you want to temporarily install something? I'll basically bring down the package, I'll use it, and after that, it won't be on your machine anymore. So for this one, I'm just going to call mine Sandbox right now because I want to show you all what's inside, and then you all will have an opportunity to create your own, building on what we've been doing today. All right, so I've named it Sandbox. And so at first glance, you see add TypeScript. Your first impression might be, oh, I'm definitely not using TypeScript, hit no. I'm going to say hit yes. And the short reason for that is because when Vue gives you the option to add the TypeScript, what it's saying is it's not saying you have to use TypeScript. It's saying we're going to configure everything so that if you ever choose to use TypeScript, it's really easy. No configuration needed kind of bit. There'll be 1 or 2 lines of code we'll add to make it basically like ignore any TypeScript errors. But one of the things that I found that's really painful when it comes to code migrations is that people who want to start sprinkling in TypeScript, usually the build toolchain is what blocks them from doing that. Because they're like, oh, I just want to try types. And then it's like, oh, you have to look at this config file, and then you have to do a tsconfig. And then by the time they've like that obstacle to getting started can be super expensive. And so if you didn't know, there's a Vue 3 and TypeScript workshop that I did, so you can watch that separately. But generally speaking, what I'm saying here is that this is great for code bases in the sense that like you can only have one, if one person wants to use types on one file, they can. You don't have to enforce it across the entire code base. And that's the benefit of having that configured. As you can see here, JSX support, this is something I do want to address, especially for those coming from the React background, is that you can use JSX with Vue. You've been seeing us do a lot with native HTML, but just know that if you really love JSX and you don't want to use native HTML, you can still do that. But personally, I do find it's advantageous to use native HTML. But just know that Vue can totally support that if that's something you prefer. We're not going to worry about Vue Router right now or Pinea. That's something we'll be covering tomorrow, or Vite Test. And we're not doing any end-to-end. But sure, let's add ESLint and Prettier. And so for those who are new to the tools chain space, ESLint is basically, and Prettier are ways to standardize how your code is formatted and how it looks. So things like, whether tabs are 2 spaces, 4 spaces, or actual tabs, semicolons, those sort of things. That's how you kind of can enforce consistency across your code base. So with that said, let me go switch branches to O4 begin, and then O4 exercise. Great. OK. So let's take a look at what's actually in here. So inside of my sandbox directory, you now see a standard Vue project that's scaffolded in Vite. OK. So a couple of things here. One, we have a source directory, which is fairly standard on front-end client framework apps these days. We have a public directory, which is going to be what's served basically to users. So basically, think of the public directory as the build tools will not do anything to it. It will just be bundled with your code when you serve it. So basically, no asset optimization, none of that. And then what we can see here as well is we have an index.html. And this is where you can see actually how your code is basically being built. In the sense that, like, if you want to drop Google font libraries, it's as simple now as coming into your index.html file and just dropping in your link to your style sheets, whatever you need. And then here we can see we have our div app as well. And then script type module here, main.ts. And this main.ts refers to this file inside of our source directory. And so you can see this should look actually pretty familiar. We're importing the create app helper method from Vue. And then we're creating an app with that. And then we're mounting it to the div ID right here. And so that's where you see that inside of index. Actually, let me split this window so that we can get them side by side. So there we go. This is where these two are talking to each other. And then you'll notice that we're also importing some CSS as well. And I'll talk more to this in a little bit. OK, so to show you just that everything works, let me go ahead and go inside of the sandbox. And I'm going to install the dependencies by running npm install. OK. So while we're doing that, what I'd like people to do is if you look up Vue DevTools on your browser, you should basically get whether it's Chrome, Firefox should have it as well. You should get an extension that you should be able to install here. So Vue.js DevTools, you'll see it has about 1,800 at the time of this recording. And so you'll want to install this because this is what's actually showing up here. So if you click on your extensions, you can go ahead and pin it if it's hidden right now for you. Because we'll be using that to explore what the Vue DevTools does for us when it comes to looking at a Vue project. OK, so inside of here, we can see everything's running now. So if we look at package.json now, let's see what commands do we have available to us. Well, we have the ability to dev, OK? And then there's a bunch of TypeScript stuff. We're not even going to worry about that right now. So npm run dev. All right, great. And let's open that up. There we go. As we can see, this is your Hello World Vue application. Now, when we take a look now, you'll notice that the DevTools, if you have that installed, will actually go ahead and light up. And so if you open up your console now, and you go into the dropdown, or if you have a really wide monitor, you might already see it, but mine's hidden since it's a little bit bigger, and click on View, you'll see that here we go. We have the dev item. Basically, our entire app now is able to be inspected inside of here. So what we're seeing here is basically we're starting to introduce the idea of components, right? Components-driven development is really popular in today's modern front-end frameworks. And so as you would expect, Vue certainly supports components, and we'll be doing a lot more with that now that we have the build tool chaining supported. So what's cool about this is that you can see as you click on the different components, it'll actually tell you a little bit about it. And so you can see that, oh, yes, here in the welcome, there's a bunch of stuff being set up. The hello world here has a message. Like, we'll be using this a lot to inspect what's going on underneath the components. But so definitely keep this in mind when we start to move forward on other things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and port over the playground that I had made. And we're going to go ahead and actually use that to create the app so to kind of show you what's going on. So the main thing to understand here is that inside of the main.ts, you'll see here inside of this app view. And so .vue files are the bread and butter of one of the reasons why I think Vue also got really popular. And so these are called single file components. And so they're single file components because, well, they have a lot going on. What you might notice, though, is that none of my syntax highlighting is working. And the reason for that is because you need to actually enable a VS Code extension. And the one that I recommend, actually kind of the standard actually, is Volar, V-O-L-A-R. So if you're using VS Code, go ahead and install that on your machine while you're at it. So I'm going to go ahead and enable mine. And it does a ton of stuff for you. Honestly, there could probably be a half-day lecture just on Volar alone. But know that it helps you out with syntax highlighting and a couple of other things as well. OK. So inside of app.view, you might notice this looks actually should look pretty familiar to you, in the sense that, OK, we have this part here, this template. This is HTML. And this template element, believe it or not, is actually built on a standard in HTML. The template element is actually a built-in thing to HTML. It's not just a view thing. But basically, it says, hey, this is the HTML that I'm managing in this specific file. The script block is what you expect. Here's the JavaScript that I'm managing. And here, we even have a style block, and that's to manage all the CSS. And so as you can see, the reason why it's called single file components is because it basically allows you to scope all the things that you care about into a single file. And that might sound like, oh, what's so special about that? But we have to remember, prior to this, a lot of times what people were doing is they would have an app.html, for example, for the template. They'd have an app.js for the JavaScript. And then they have an app.css for the CSS. And to some extent, like, there's nothing wrong with that architecture. But for a lot of us who enjoy, like, especially when you're navigating back between files, it's actually really helpful just to have it all in one place. And at least that's what I found in my experience. Now, granted, there's nothing stopping you from choosing your own adventure. So all these blocks here, they're optional. So I can delete this, and we can only use the template and the script. And the other thing that people often misunderstand when it comes to single file components as well is that the script, template, and style blocks are just what's default out of the box. There are actually other libraries and plugins that utilize things like a docs plugin. And so it'll use a docs tag wrapper, and then basically whatever you document there will be associated with that specific component. And so really, it's actually an open canvas for people's imaginations when it comes to how they might want to scope how information is being managed across their code base. All right. So let's go ahead and migrate some stuff over, shall we? So I'm going to go ahead and open up my playground here. Let's do that, and then switch that over here. All right, let me zoom out a little bit. So I think it's a little bit harder to, wait, can I zoom in? Yeah, that's a little bit harder to read. Here we go. OK. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this boilerplate stuff. You all will understand how this works by the end of the workshop, so don't worry there. But this way, we keep it simple. We have a script block. We have a template block. In other words, our JavaScript and our HTML. So what we can do here is we can basically copy in our HTML here, so all the way down to the div. And we're going to go ahead and drop it inside of our template. OK, a lot of things are going to be breaking right now, and that's totally fine. Because what we've got to do, we got to copy all this data that we have here. So we have a bunch of stuff inside of here, and we're just going to copy all of it. Or in this case, I'm cutting it. The main difference, in tactically speaking, though, is that what we got to do is rather than saying like create app here, because the app has already been created, we basically are saying let's export the object that we're going to be using. So in other words, here is the specific object that will reflect the JavaScript for this file. And so if I save, I think I'm missing a curly brace. Something's broken. Oh, that's why. OK, hang on. I pasted the wrong thing. There we go. OK. So what we see here, we're back to the point where we have our data here. We have all the stuff that we just copy-pasted. And we have our template. So we see some stuff yelling at us. Yep, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so let's see if this actually did anything for us. So you'll notice, OK, our data is there. It's just super messy. The reason it's super messy is because we have, inside of our main.ts, you saw earlier we have this main CSS. We're going to wipe that out. Because right now we just want to work with standard things and make sure everything's just working. And so sure enough, there we go. We have our app, and it's up and running. OK. So the the first thing I want to address here is that you'll notice now, before we weren't getting any sort of errors when we did the index.html way, because basically Volar and these sort of extensions allow us to basically identify common problems that people sort of, or mistakes that they make when it comes to this stuff. And so you'll notice here we got these error messages here because it's saying that whenever we iterate through an element, it's expected to have a vbind key directive. And so what does that mean exactly? Well, basically, when you're having the frameworks track the elements that they're looping through, it's good to give them some sort of identifier so that they know whether or not something's changed or not. Without that identifier, you basically run the risk of relying solely on the data to like figure out what's working. And especially when it comes to animation, it'll bite you in the butt constantly. And so typically what people do then is they will do the vbind directive because the key needs to be a unique key for everything. And so we can also shortcut this as well to just like this, vkey. And then we can do something as simple as, for example, I sometimes will just take out the index, and I'll say I will do a ESLint string, the ES6 string, and I'll go item-index, for example. And so this here then basically provides a custom key. Now, most of the time when you're working with databases, hopefully you have UUIDs and that kind of thing to populate it. But for the sake of like sort of demoing this at the moment, this is how we could fulfill this requirement by basically creating our own key. So you'll see here, it notices that this is, I think, identical to the other one. But index, oh, it doesn't. So there you go, number index, great. What does it not like about it? Oh, it'll format it. OK, there we go. And just like that, we have our app now working inside of the build toolchain. Great. OK. This is the final bit that I was talking about. Remember how I was talking about we've enabled TypeScript, but you don't have to use it? The main thing here is that you'll notice Volar is basically saying, hey, I thought we were in TypeScript. What's going on? So what you got to do here is go into your tsconfig.json. And under the compiler options, we can allow JS to true. And that'll basically prevent it from yelling at us anymore if we don't use TypeScript. But on the other hand, if anyone ever does use TypeScript, it's just going to work magically. And all the configurations already work. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this code. So check out branch. Actually, what I'm going to do real quick, I realized I called this sandbox. But we're going to call it playground to be consistent with the HTML file that I created earlier. And then let me just update this real quick to playground. And then does this have a name? It does. Playground. OK. So we got a bunch of stuff here. Git commit add. Git commit add playground project. OK. OK. So do people have any questions about the sort of the project overview that I've shown so far? Because we will dive deep into each folder as we go forward. But I just want to see, like, as far as the general setup, first impressions, any questions on that end?
Did anybody follow all of that and get it working?
No. We're going to do the exercise next.
OK.
Yeah. So that was just like expose. So yeah, oh yes, go.
If you have an existing project, would you probably not recommend trying to Vitifize it?
So the question here is around if you have an existing project that already works, whether or not to switch it over to Vite. Honestly, most of the people who've switched to toolchain have found very little difference in terms of like, it's not like other build tools where like something usually major breaks. So I guess a lot of it boils down to actually your dependencies. I would take a look at that. If you have a lot of dependencies that rely on some sort of Webpack build, then in that case, Vite might be a little premature. But if it's a more evergreen project where it has like standard JavaScript stuff that it's JavaScript libraries installing that might already have ESM support for ES modules, then that would be a great case where like, let's just try and see what happens because the performance improvements that people are experiencing on Vite are pretty significant. And so honestly, it's worth like an hour time box effort just to see if you can improve the DX on that regard. Yeah.
Thanks.
OK. So to kind of review what just happened, because I know that was a lot. So we went ahead and scaffolded a brand new project using the create view CLI, which created this entire playground directory. And then the key thing here is that inside of our index.html, we can see here that we are getting our view stuff from this source main.ts. That's how you're going to follow this. And so inside of main.ts, this is where we can see, yes, this is where we're mounting it to the app. And then more importantly, that create app, right? If we look back at our app right here inside of Playground, remember how we passed this object here? This object now has been exported out into its own file. So that's what I was talking about in terms of modularity. So this app now, so then to continue that line of thought, to open it here, this object that we see here that we're exporting, this object is actually what's being dropped in here. So that's how those three things are being connected. And this is also one of the reasons why build tools can be super confusing, because there are a lot of moving pieces to it. And so to just sort of dive right in, get your feet wet, what we're going to do for this exercise is you're going to go ahead and, let me maximize this. Go ahead and create a brand new project with create view inside of our directory that we've already been using. And this time you're going to rename it to whatever your show name -forum. So in my case, it'll be like Avatar Last Airbender -forum. And then we're going to migrate the stuff that we've been doing inside of index.html into app.view. So go ahead and dive right in. Let's give this like 10 minutes. No, actually, let's give this 15 minutes just to make sure everyone's good on this end. Because I'll walk around to see how this migration goes, because this is a fairly significant one.